This is the second video of the series called Four Cornerstones of the Romans Foundation. I am recording this in a different location, not with my usual setup, so I don't have the mic attached to the PC. I'm sitting in a booth with a little bit of an echo, so my hope and trust is that the audio on this recording is going to be acceptable for you guys. Nevertheless, let me continue, because this is the rare opportunity that I have to actually record another video. Now, let me remind you that the first video we dealt with the Romans foundation as such. The context of this video series is to actually highlight or put focus on each individual cornerstone of that Romans foundation. So let me remind you very quickly in the next slide what we discussed in that first video on the Romans foundation itself. Then the rest of this video is going to be on the first cornerstone, and then subsequent videos I shall deal individually with the other three cornerstones as well. But here's just a quick reminder on the Romans foundation that we discussed in the first video. All right, so as you can see on the slide, Romans is right down at the bottom, and it acts as the foundation for all of Paul's church epistles, the 9 church epistles. Those church epistles teach us concepts and principles that we build upon the foundation, but everything relies on the Romans foundation. Basically, the Romans foundation is the stability that we have as grace believers today. What we learn in Romans sets up that foundation and provides us the stability from the beginning with the gospel that Paul opens up with in Romans chapter 1 verse 16, all the way through to his closing statements in Romans chapter 16 verse 25 and 26, which refers to that it is God that gives us that stability according to his gospel, Paul's gospel, and the mysteries, the revelation of the mysteries, as well as the scriptures of the prophets. So what we learn in between Romans chapters 1 and 16 is the full foundation of Romans that provides us the stability, or at least the setup, to become stable as believers as we continue to grow in the doctrine, the mystery doctrine of Paul. So for the rest of this video, which I'm trying to keep short, hence breaking up these cornerstones into individual parts, the rest of this video is going to be on cornerstone number 1, the first of 4 cornerstones that actually provides us that stability and the context of the book of Romans being our foundation. So let's move on to that first cornerstone for the rest of this video. All right, let's have a look at this first cornerstone of the foundation of Romans. Now, surprisingly, there's actually quite a lot to speak about here. There's a lot of context that can actually be put to this particular cornerstone. But in the attempt to try and keep it short, I'd like to maybe just go through the primary or the key verse of this particular section, and then maybe just discuss certain points just to bring the primary point into view, which I'll mention to you shortly. So anyways, as you can see on the slide, the first cornerstone is God's righteousness. I've just put man's depravity into there as well, because at the end of the day, it is a matter of weighing up God's righteousness, or instead of weighing up, I should say comparing God's righteousness versus the absolute depravity of human beings. And that is the key to understanding this first cornerstone. I'll tell you a little later on in the video why it is the key itself. But for now, let's just start with looking at the main verse that comes out of the first few chapters of Romans, which, by the way, makes up this cornerstone. It's more Romans 1 chapters 1 through to chapters 3, but we can include chapter 4 in this case as well, because basically chapter 5 starts the second cornerstone. So I'll just mention Romans chapters 1 through to 4. Within those chapters, if you had to study out those chapters, the primary theme that comes from those 4 chapters is God's righteousness compared to the depravity of humanity. So that is the first cornerstone, and it is of vital importance, critical importance, that we get a firm understanding of the way up between God's righteousness and man's depravity. And Paul dedicates almost 3 chapters, the first 3 chapters in Romans, to understanding this. And by the way, can I just mention as well that if you consider the gospel, the grace gospel, the primary topic of the grace gospel is, of course, the cross of Christ, and the fact that we should believe in that cross work, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. But there's a very important factor that most of us tend to ignore when presenting the gospel, and that is what Paul starts off with in the book of Romans, where he discusses that God is righteous, that God is just, that God is holy, that God cannot, how can I say, not cannot, but he cannot accept sin. Okay, God is absolutely just and holy, and sin cannot come into his presence. So we need to understand, in other words, that us humans in our depraved, sinful state, as born into sin, with a sinful nature by default, innate within us, that we cannot come to God in this state, that God is absolutely righteous and holy. Therefore, God had to do something for us in order to bring us to be able to stand before him. And this is where the first cornerstone comes into play, is the fact that we as humans need to understand that we need God. All right, God does not need us, but his love for us draws us in. But we can only come into his presence from our point of view when we accept God's standards. All right. In other words, if we try and come to God in our own self, in our own state, it is impossible. There is no way that you and I can come before God and be acquitted or be pronounced holy and righteous and innocent. We need to understand that we rely on God to save us, that we cannot save ourselves. All right, so this is an incredibly important part of the gospel, because if we don't present the fact that humans cannot save themselves and cannot even come close to doing that, it tells us, therefore, that we need to lay ourselves down, that we need to stop being so high-minded and understand that God is willing to save us, but we have to come to God in light of humility, in light of bowing our knee, and in light of receiving his gift of salvation and justification without us trying to do anything. Because, the mind of people, the mind of humans is, I want to get the glory. I will do whatever I can so that I can boast. That is the natural human state. And God's not going to accept us with that mindset, with that attitude. We need to come knowing that God has gifted us salvation, but we have to come in his terms, through his Son. All right? And that we cannot save ourselves or work for our salvation or earn salvation in any form or any way. All right. Sorry, my phone just went off. I just want to put it on silent. Okay. So nevertheless, let's briefly start, and I want to keep this short again, so I'm just going to run through the key points, and I'm sure you'll be able to pick up the gist of this first cornerstone. But as you can see on the video, or rather on the slide, I keep on saying video, the primary scripture there is, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." That is you and I in our natural state, ungodly, unrighteous. God's wrath is revealed from heaven against that. So Paul starts with the gospel, with the presentation of the gospel in Romans chapter 1. He starts this off with this key note, that God's wrath is revealed. And there is something to learn in this. All right? We need to understand, therefore, that the gospel presentation that we give to people is not just the cross of Christ. It is the wrath of God. The cross of Christ has been set up because of the wrath of God. All right, so the verse continues, "Who holds truth in unrighteousness?" Us. All right. "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has revealed or showed it to them." That's in itself a very interesting point that I'm not going to elaborate on at this point of time. But please take note that, this is at least my point of view, that if you think in terms of atheism, the fact that you don't put trust in a higher power, or you don't believe in a higher power, that you believe rather in yourself, that verse speaks entirely against that concept. All right, that mindset is the fact that God has manifest himself, and that God has shown people that he exists. All right, because there is an innate knowledge of God within us. God has placed inside us knowledge of him. Besides what Paul speaks of in the rest of Romans chapter 1, is that we can look at the world out there, at nature and the sunrise and sunset, etc., and we can see God in creation. That's another witness of his presence and existence. Nevertheless, that is the starting point of the gospel. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against us, against godliness and unrighteousness. All right, now please remember that Paul, just before he starts with the wrath of God, in verse 16, he says that he's not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone that believes, Jew first and also to the Greek. And then the very next verse he says, "For therein," in other words, for within the gospel message is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. Within the gospel is the righteousness of God revealed. That is part of the power of the gospel, but that righteousness is revealed through understanding God's wrath and how he presented salvation through his Son, that we can come as ungodly and unrighteous before him in righteousness. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Nevertheless, Paul just says, let me present the gospel, this gospel that I'm unashamed of, for it is God's power to save. Within this gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. Then Paul starts in the next verse, verse 18, with, "For the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness." And then Paul elaborates, which I'm not going to do because you can go and read the rest of Romans chapter 1 and 2 and the first part of chapter 3. Within that section is the verdict of men. All right, men, whether Jew or Gentile. All right, it doesn't matter what standing you have. Paul eventually in chapter 3 says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." We have all become unprofitable before God. And God therefore has done something on behalf of us, since we have no way to save ourselves. All right, so there we go. There's a few more things that I'm going to mention briefly, but in what I've already mentioned here concerning the gospel, concerning God revealing his righteousness, and that righteousness is presented through the fact that God is righteous and man is depraved. Okay, and we need, as human beings, to come to that understanding that we need to come by God's standards. There is no way we can earn or work for or even justify ourselves, right? With regard to I can get salvation myself. I can earn it myself. Okay, so I'd like to almost put it this way. If righteousness is revealed, if God reveals his righteousness through the gospel, that should tell us that our condition is unrighteous and that we have a need to gain righteousness, not of ourselves, okay, because that's the gospel message is all through Christ. But it informs us, just the fact that we put the spotlight on the righteousness of God, it informs us that it's a component that you and I are missing. And that's the key component as part of salvation. God starts the gospel, or the gospel starts with our dire condition in relation to God. And that is key. I say it again, that is key. We have to come to an acknowledgement of the fact that we need salvation. I'll tell you why. If it is not presented in that way, if it's just the cross of Christ, of Jesus Christ that's presented, we will accept the cross of Christ, but we will always have a high-mindedness in us. We will always have, all right, well then, I will accept the cross of Christ and what he has done for me, but I can add to it. I can make it better. Guys, I tell you now, that is where a lot of confusion comes in our churches, in Christians who think that they can work for salvation, who think that they can earn salvation or add to improve salvation. Guys, I'm not saying that people like that are not saved, but it certainly opens up an avenue where they can think that they can improve salvation or do something to add to it. You see, that's the problem. We have to come, the very first part of the gospel is we have to acknowledge that we are hopeless, that we are in dire straits, that we are depraved. And unless God steps in with grace and the presentation of a gift, there is absolutely no way that we are ever going to become saved or even come close to being saved. I'd like to put it to the sense that think of a very deep well, a water well, where you send the bucket down to get water. Say, for instance, you've fallen into a very deep well and the walls of this well is slippery, almost like Teflon. There is no foothold. It is too deep for you to jump to get out. You cannot climb your way out. There is nothing within the well to even assist. You are going to be stuck there. There is no way to get out of this well and get to salvation. The only way that you can get out of this well is if God sends that bucket down and then pulls you back up. But other than that, you are dead. You are dead in that well. You are as good as gone, because there is no way that you will ever be able to get out of this well without God's help. It's a simple analogy, but at the end of the day, you and I need to understand that that is the position that we are in. and that the gospel must reveal this to us, so that when we come to the point of hearing the good news of the gospel, the justification, the cross of Christ, the fact that Jesus has done all the work for us, the fact that the gospel is a free gift, God understands in giving this gift that it has to be given freely, because there is no way you can even earn it. There is no way you even deserve it. Can you see? We have to have this mindset. I can labor on this point, speaking from different angles over and over again, and my heart's desire is to do it, because I do understand that people do not have this full understanding of how absolutely depraved and ungodly and unrighteous they are before God. We are as filthy rags before God, Isaiah says. So when we present the gospel, and of course when you receive the gospel, it is of very important note to bring this understanding, so that when a person comes to the point of hearing that God has saved us through his Son, and that he gifts salvation to us freely, that it comes to the point of we are relieved that God has done this for us. Because if you don't present it in this way, and I know I'm repeating myself again, but nevertheless, if you don't do it in this way, people will not have that sense of how utterly in the gutters they were, to the point that they are almost relieved to hear that God gifts salvation freely. And if people don't get that message, that's when you get people that say, all right, I believe in the cross of Christ, in his death, burial, and resurrection, which means you're saved, if that is your heart's conviction and you put your trust in that for God to save you. But then there's a measure of high-mindedness and egotistical nature, that they say, well, let me also add by doing good works. Let me also add to that salvation and improve that salvation by getting baptized or speaking in tongues or this or that. Let's learn from this. All right? Let's learn. Even if you're saved right now, even if you heard the gospel 20 years ago, it will still benefit you to understand that we stand before God by means of a free gift that he's given us in Christ Jesus. And that even after 20 years, nothing, absolutely nothing that you have done has come close to even earning you or making you be able to deserve or boast in your righteousness, in your salvation. Because nothing you've done, no matter how holy and pious and religious and fervent you were to the cause of God and the gospel, nothing you've ever done has come close to God being able to say, well, you certainly deserve salvation. I tell you now, if that is your mindset, you have a wrong mindset of who you are in your natural state before God. If you are saved, you are fully righteous. You are acquitted. God, you have that atonement, that at one-ment with God. You are fully justified. Christ's righteousness has been imputed upon you. Your salvation is secure and eternal and glorious. But if there's an attitude of understanding that there's a measure of whatever I've done in the past that adds to it or that makes me deserve it, you have a wrong understanding of who you really are without Christ. So anyway, this is the message that I wanted to really share. If I look through the notes that I'm seeing on the screen here, there's so much more, that I can say. Let me just run through a little bit. Romans 1 verse 24 says that, wherefore God gave them up to uncleanness. There's three levels of the ungodliness and unrighteousness of humans, right? And this weighs into how we need to understand our level of ungodliness and unrighteousness, so that it can help us to understand that justification is absolutely free and a gift of God. Romans 1:24 says, wherefore God also gave them over to uncleanness through the lusts of their own heart. All right, God abandons us. That's another point that I have written down here, which, it's just the fact that we are vile within. Okay, what is the uncleanness that I'm referring to? It's just unrestrained ungodliness and unrighteousness. If God doesn't work His righteousness in us, and His word does not cleanse our mind, by our natural state, we are vile. Sin will have no restraint in us. We will just grow worse and worse. Have a look at the world out there. The second level, in other words, this uncleanness is just our natural state. The second level is that God gave them over to vile affections. Right? That's Romans 1 verse 26. This is just the degrading of humanity without God. God gives them, what it means when God says He gives them over is just, God just lifts His hand. In other words, if you are not at all interested in connecting with God, in understanding God, in forming a relationship with God, in crying out towards God for salvation, if you just continue in your vile way as humanity, God lifts His hand off you and says, well, then you just go your own way, and you will see where you end up. And the first level, when you go in your own way, is uncleanness. It's the vileness of the flesh. In other words, there's just no restraint. You will just go and do sin, and sin more and sin more. The next level down from that is where God gives you further over, and that comes to a point where you start getting into vile affections. Men with men, women with women, the unnatural state of the opposite of how God has designed and created us. Okay. And that is, of course, sin against your own body. All right, so that degrades even further. And then verse 28, so that was 24, then 26. Verse 28 is that final stage where God just, the verse says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. A reprobate mind, a mind that is basically destitute of judgment. There's no understanding of right and wrong. Headstrong, stubborn in evil. That is really what this reprobate mind is all about. It's not a mind that can't think for itself. And in the world, you could have smart people, you can have intelligent people, but their mind is so retracted from the righteousness and the innocence and the holiness of God, that even though they're smart, even though they are intelligent people within the worldly context, they are just so far from understanding God and His wisdom and His holiness and His perfection and His existence. A reprobate mind, determined to forget about God, given over to evil, ungodly to the nth degree. And this is the declining of the human state. And you can see it in the world. And you can take note of people and even at what level they are. All right, I'll tell you now, if you want to see the decline of humanity, whether it's an individual or a nation, you just look at the state that they're in. If their minds are set to just being vile, just being, they are just sinning and not caring about it. They're just living it up in the world. Right? That's the first stage. Then you get to vile affections. sexual sins, sins against the body, sins against the natural order and the natural state of things as God has designed us. It's next level down. And then the level from that is just that reprobate mind. There is just no concept anymore of God. There's just no concept of godliness. There's just no concept of any form of righteous judgment and judging according to righteousness. It's just vile and sinful and dark. Okay, so interesting to note, Paul points to all of this in the first chapter of Romans, and it all constitutes to this first cornerstone of the book of Romans. And the first cornerstone that provides us stability in our Christian life is the sense and the fact that we need to understand our depraved nature versus the absolute holiness, righteousness, and justice of God. All right. So maybe the last thing I can point out here in wrapping up is when we come to the point of understanding the depravity of our human heart and the absolute righteousness of God. Now remember, it's both. It's how depraved we are to the point that we cannot even see God because of his high and lofty position in righteousness and justice and holiness. We must understand that there is absolutely no way possible that we have any chance in deserving or working for or earning our righteousness and our position before God. No chance. Okay, because God's too high and we are too low. God's righteousness accentuates our depravity. It's almost like the law for Israel accentuated sin. All right, in other words, God gave Israel the law to show them their need for their Messiah. And in Romans chapter 6, Paul speaks about that as well, chapter 6 and 7. All right, he speaks about the law and how the law, as holy as it is, it just brings about sin because it brings you an understanding of sin, and then your sin nature, your human nature just craves after that sin. And when you come to a point of understanding that whatever I'm desiring is sin because the law tells me it's sin, well, then it just increases sin. So it's almost like the context of the law that God gave to Israel accentuated their sin and brought them to an understanding of sin. So the righteousness of God accentuates our depravity and our absolute need for a Savior. I'm just weighing that up, just an interesting context or a simulation. Okay, so there it is. To truly know God's grace depends on a firm grasp or a firm understanding of God's righteousness. Let me say it again. To truly know God's grace depends on a firm understanding of God's righteousness. If I understand God's utter righteousness, then I open myself up to his grace, because it points to the fact that I can never achieve or earn it or deserve it myself. Okay, now it's coming to a point where I'm repeating myself for the 7th time. Okay, so I think it's a good time to end this video. I'd like to remind you that this is the first cornerstone, God's righteousness. We have to understand his righteousness versus our depravity, so that when we get to the second cornerstone in Romans chapter 5, it speaks of God's justification. And it mentions, of course, in Romans chapter 3 and 4 as well. Right? So, I mean, there's a bit of a cross section. There's not a clear cut there. But bottom line is, when Paul starts to speak about our justification, what God has done for us through Christ, through the cross of Christ, etc., and this free gift that God is willing to give us, we have to have come through that first cornerstone, understanding where we are in relation to the holiness and the righteousness of God. So there it is. That is cornerstone number 1. absolutely incredibly important to understand that in the context of then being able to receive almost willingly this free gift of God, and being thankful and grateful for it, because at the end of the day it is a free gift, but it is a gift and a half through the death of his son, that God simply provides us justification as long as we trust in him. Okay. And there's nothing we can do. There's no work, there's no action, there's nothing we can add to that, because God's free gift is Christ alone. Okay, we will have a look at the second cornerstone in the next video, and that's where we start to have a look at this free gift in a little bit more detail. I trust this was beneficial to you. Remember this, and keep this in mind as we continue up these 4 cornerstones in the little video series. It's again literally a half an hour of video. I'm trying to keep these 10 minutes, but it's just impossible, when you start to ramble on like this. It's like I have the need to press it in and press it in and press it in again, and we need to hear it over and over and over, because that's the standing that we have, and oftentimes things go in and out. Okay, so excuse and I apologize for the repeat, but nevertheless there it is. You guys can look into it. Go and read Romans chapters 1 and 4, 1 through to 4, right, and get a good grasp of what Paul is saying within those chapters. And then when I see you again in the next video, we will then start looking into justification and the free gift of God by his grace, his utter grace. Thanks very much for listening to me again, and I will see you in the next one.